This video will show you how to identify the subject and main verb in a sentence. Being able to correctly identify the subject and verb in a sentence is essential for correcting run-on sentences, one of the most common types of grammatical errors that college students make in their writing, as well as other types of common grammar errors. I found that most college freshmen have at least some run-on sentences in their writing, and it's one of those grammar errors that can make your writing look unsophisticated or even immature. So this is definitely something that you want to eliminate from your writing. Being able to identify the subject and verb in a sentence is the first step in knowing how to correct run-on sentences. This video is intended as preparation for several subsequent grammar lessons that will be covered in future videos. How you'll use this information may not be totally clear after completing this lesson, but the importance of this lesson will make more sense when you've completed those future lessons. Before we talk about how to identify the subject and verb of a sentence, we'll first need to talk about how sentences work, what makes a sentence complete, and the components that make up a sentence. A sentence can be defined as a written report of an event, situation, or condition. Essentially, the function of a sentence is to say that something happened, an action, and that somebody or something did that action. The purpose of the sentence is to tell somebody about it. The something that happened is called the verb, and the somebody or something that did the action is called the subject. Let's quickly look at two examples that show how subjects and verbs work within sentences. Then we'll look at a strategy that can make identifying subjects and verbs easier. In this first example, Maya majored in electrical engineering at Florida State University. The action, what was done, also known as the main verb, is majored, and the person who did the action, the majoring in electrical engineering, is Maya. So Maya is the subject of the sentence. Here's a second example. My sister studied abroad in China last fall. In this sentence, the action is studied, and who did the studying, the subject, is sister. Now we're going to look at a strategy for identifying subjects and verbs within sentences. From the examples we just looked at, this may seem pretty simple, and sometimes it is. But in some cases it can be difficult to see exactly what the action and the doer of the action are in a sentence. This is especially true when we're writing about academic topics because we're often talking about abstract ideas. As in this sentence, justice seems to be the highest aspiration of humankind. Here, the verb is seems. Seems is an abstract verb. It refers to a concept, not a concrete action like walk or write. We can't see anyone seeming to be something. The subject here, justice, could also be hard to identify because it's also not something we can see in front of us. It's an abstract idea. Sentences like this one are why we're going to study a three-step strategy that should make identifying a sentence's subject and verb easier. First, ask yourself what's happening in this sentence. Find the single word that answers this question and circle it. This is the sentence's verb. Next, ask yourself who or what is doing the action. Find the single word that answers this question. Underline it. This is the sentence's subject. Finally, apply the sense test. Ask yourself, can the subject I identified do this action? If the answer is yes, you've identified the subject and verb. Let's apply the three-step strategy to a few examples. The steps we just went over are at the bottom of the screen. Here's a first one. Tomas complained bitterly about the questions on his math exam. First, we ask ourselves, what's happening in the sentence? What's the action? And we see that the action is complained. Second, we ask, who's doing the action? And we see that the person doing the complaining is Tomas. Tomas is the subject, so we underline it. In step 3, we apply the sense test. And we can clearly see that Tomas could do the action of complaining, so we can be pretty certain we've correctly identified the subject and the verb. Here's the second example. In our chemistry lab, we record the reactions of chemical combinations in our lab books. Applying the first step, we see that the action is record, so we circle it. We are the ones doing the recording. We is the subject, so we underline it. Moving on to step 3 and applying the sense test, it's clear that we can do the recording, so the subject and verb are identified correctly. Now here's one for you to try on your own. Pause the video for a moment and try to identify the subject and verb. Remember that the steps in the process are listed at the bottom of the screen. You should have identified earned as the verb and everyone as the subject. Here's one more for you to try on your own. Pause the video and try to work through it. In this sentence, formed is the verb and students is the subject. One thing in particular that can make identifying subjects and verbs difficult is the use of compound subjects and compound verbs. So we'll take a few minutes to look at what these are and how they can cause problems when you're trying to identify subjects and verbs. We'll jump right into some examples. In this first one, Maya and Mala sat next to each other in biology class. The verb is sat, but we have two people who did the sitting, Maya and Mala. This is what's known as a compound subject. You'll see how these can be especially problematic when you study run-on sentences and sentence fragments. Here's a second example. Maya wrote and edited her essay in under an hour. In this sentence, wrote is a main verb, and edit is also a main verb. Both of these verbs have one subject, Maya. Here we have one person doing two actions in the same sentence. This is what's known as a compound verb. It might also be helpful to know that a sentence could have more than two verbs. You could have a sentence with three compound verbs and one subject, as in this example. Or you could have a sentence with two subjects and two verbs, like in the second one. You could have four subjects and three verbs, or just about any other combination. That's part of what makes compound subjects and compound verbs so confusing. One last thing that can make identifying subjects and verbs difficult is the use of helping verbs, which is extremely common. The use of helping verbs has to do with verb tense, which I cover in a separate video. We'll just look at it briefly here. Here's how helping verbs work. A sentence's verb is sometimes made up of two or more separate words. In these cases, a helping verb is attached to a main verb to give other information, such as when something happened, like in this example. The action in this sentence is has traveled. The helping verb has is added to the sentence to communicate that the sister, the sentence's subject, traveled to China in the past and that she'll probably want to travel there again. Here's a second example. My sister had been planning to travel to China for several years. The complete main verb here is had been planning. The use of the helping verbs had and been communicate that the sister, the sentence's subject, did the planning before she did the traveling, which we'd hope someone would do if they're traveling all the way to China. All three verbs, the two helping verbs, and the action verb traveled, are part of the sentence's main verb, and knowing that will be important when you work on correcting other types of grammar errors. That concludes this video on subject and verb identification. If you're viewing this as part of a module in Canvas, click on Take the Quiz below the video to get some extra practice. If you're having trouble with the quiz items, make sure to watch the video again. If you still have trouble, contact me to get some extra help.